When was New Testament written? And who wrote them?
All the three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were written before 60 AD. We know that John would have been written much later, about 80 or 90 AD. We know that Acts and also the letters of Paul were written within 15 to 30 years of Christ's death. So all the three Gospels, Acts, Revelation, all the Paul's letters were all written before the disciples left Jerusalem in 70 AD. This book, we make no problems. We know it was written by men. We make that claim from the very beginning. We know who wrote them. The man's names are usually given to the books. John was written by John, Matthew by Matthew, Mark by Mark, but we know that Moses wrote the first 5 books. What we do say is, that which is written, we can trust.
Let's hear the truth from Professor Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman is the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Professor Ehrman completed his Master's of Divinity and Ph.D. degrees at Princeton Seminary. He is an expert on the New Testament and the history of early Christianity. 5 of his books have been on the New York Times bestseller list. His books have been translated into 27 languages.
When were the Gospels written? Well, they are not contemporary to the events they narrate. Scholars debate when the Gospels were written, but by far the most common datings are that Mark was written sometime around 65 or 70 AD, Luke and Matthew about 10 or 15 years later, John maybe 10 or 15 years later, so John maybe around the year 90 or 95, Matthew and Luke around 80 to 85. These are the dates that are taught throughout the universities and divinity schools and seminaries of North America and Europe. I take them to be right for reasons that I can give you if anybody really wants to know. It's complicated arguments. If these dates are correct, it means that our earliest account of Jesus' resurrection is 40 years after the event. 40 years after the event. Well, Paul was writing before that, wasn't it? Yes, Paul was writing before that. Paul talks about the resurrection in 1 Corinthians. Well, that's 20 years after the event, so that's better. The Gospels give us the narratives. Paul makes reference to it, but there's a 20-year gap. You don't have somebody who was there writing about it. Second point, none of the authors were eyewitnesses. Paul himself indicates that he was not an eyewitness, and none of the gospel writers was an eyewitness. People, of course, call the gospel books Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, they call them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because we don't know who wrote these books, and there's no point calling them Sam, Fred, Jerry, and Harry. I mean, they're written by people. We don't know who they were written by. They are anonymous. You might not think so because they have the title, The Gospel According to Matthew. Whoever put that title on it was an editor later. The original books are all anonymous, written in the third person. Moreover, the followers of Jesus were Aramaic-speaking peasants from Galilee, lower-class men who were not educated. In fact, Peter and John in Acts chapter 4, verse 13 are literally said to be illiterate. They couldn't read and write. Of course not. They were fishermen. They didn't go to school. The vast majority of people in the ancient world never learned to read, let alone write. And their native language was Aramaic. These books are written in Greek by highly educated, rhetorically trained writers who are skilled in Greek composition. Probably not disciples and don't claim to be disciples. Where did these authors get their stories from? Well, if they were not disciples of Jesus, they must have heard the stories from somebody, who heard the stories from somebody, who heard the stories from somebody, who heard them from somebody. Stories about Jesus, including his resurrection, had been in circulation year after year after year from the time that his disciples knew that he got killed and believed he got raised from the dead. They told stories to convert people. They improved the stories sometimes. They changed the stories sometimes. The stories got modified in the process of transmission over the course of decades before anybody wrote the stories down.
Conclusion. Original New Testament books were written half a century after Jesus by people who were not eyewitnesses. No one knows where it was written or who wrote them. a question for every Christian who are honest, knowledgeable, and not close-minded or obstinate. Is New Testament trustworthy? An honest person will never respond to this question yes. The honest answer to this question is no.
Like, share, and subscribe to create awareness. We are also available on Facebook, Google+, Twitter, and Pal Talk.